Hello, students, and welcome to week 6 or module 6 lecture. This is going to be the one of the last ones. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending when you're watching this. And welcome to our final readings lecture in Soc 334. This week we'll be exploring access, not just whether you have a device or a login, but the deep structural, social, and technological dynamics that determine who is included, who is excluded, and how these boundaries are made durable, per se. It's going to be a longer lecture, but buckle in. I'll try to do as fast as I can without losing context. And our question to kind of build your foundation for this module is, how do socio-technical systems structure access? And how can Scott, social construction of technology, and actor network theory, and Michel Foucault's idea of biopower, as well as disciplinary power, help us to understand that process? And so we are going to be first addressing Chester McMaster's article and the Urban Forestry Equity Report. We learn that infrastructures where broadband lines, tree canopies, or energy grids aren't neutral or accidental in this reading. Through the lens of Scott, we understand that these systems are designed through competing interpretations, negotiations, and even social powers. The form they ultimately take, whether community-owned or broadband or utility monopolized, energy reflects a process of interpretive closure, as talked about in your reading, where one visible becomes dominant and others are quote unquote sidelined, right? The idea of broadband as a public good, once hotly debated in policy circles, has now settled around corporate control by entities like Comcast or Cox or AT&T. Chester and McMaster argue that this is not mere happenstance. It's a pathway dependency shaped by decisions that prioritize capital investment and return over community access. So when we use this lens of Scott, right, we start seeing these ways that can help decode the idea that infrastructure is built through socio-technical closure. But the readings take us even further than this. Chester and McMaster bring stratification economics and Fraser's concept of meta-injustice to argue that infrastructures like energy grids aren't just unequally distributed. They're embedded in exclusionary logics. Fraser identifies these interlocking domains where injustices operate as economic, distribution of resource, cultural, recognition of group status, and political, representation and power. Energy injustice, as described in the article, spans all three of these, right? Low-income or racially marginalized groups are less likely to be represented in regulatory decision-making political, more likely to suffer from environmental harm like sacrifices or sacrifice zones, that would be cultural, and more often face unaffordable energy bills or disconnections, economic. So now you can see how it's not just this random happenstance, as Fraser talks to us about. To bring this home here to Arizona, as this is where we are doing your lectures, you may be somewhere else when you're hearing that, but we are at Arizona State, we can examine the role of APS, right? A major electronic controller here. We have APS, there's a few others, but it's primarily APS, and their control over energy rates and infrastructure developments. Despite mounting public concern over rising energy costs and blackouts during extreme heat, APS retains regulatory dominance. In 2019, not that long ago, but not that short ago, this is pre-pandemic, right? They were accused of influencing the Arizona Corporate Commission through political donations. A clear example of how infrastructure access and decision-making are filtered through power structures, not democratic representation. In this case, APS's business model exemplifies what Davis, if you think back to your former readings, would call a club goods. Resources like energy that should be public but are financially or functionally gated by capital, access, and geography. They are constantly telling Arizona they're going to raise their prices by $200 or $300 or 2 or 3%. And there really isn't much pushback you can give as Arizonians because we won't survive if we don't have cooling. So as students within this course, right, it becomes important to think of this. But the urban forestry equity study aligns with this point by showing that green infrastructures like tree shade are also disproportionately absent in low-income and minority neighborhoods. Treeequity.org is amazing. Tree equity score, sorry. These are remnants of past zoning and racial convents, right, and urban planning decisions. Again, not natural outcomes, but stabilized configurations of inequality. The social construction technology lets us see how these configurations could have been different. Stratification theories push us to ask why they weren't and what structures keep them in place, per se. right? As students within this course, again, the takeaway in this, energy lines, broadband cables, and trees are not just quote unquote things. They are forms of material politics. They are infrastructures of participation, safety, and survival. They reflect decisions about who deserves to be cool in a heat wave, who gets to connect to the internet, and who has power, both literally and figuratively, scarily. And this then brings us into the next part of this conversation of now that we've discussed kind of Kessel, the other articles of McMaster, and looking at even tying it back to Davis and Chester and Fraser, we're going to go to the idea of mobility maternalized networks in your other reading by Kesselring. So Kesselring's 2017's framework of mobility regimes fits directly into our actor network theory lens. And it helps us understand mobility not just as personal trait, freedom, choice, or movement, but as the outcome of socio-technical networks composed of apps, vehicles, drivers, oil prices, insurance systems, transport policies, and rider expectations. All these human and non-human actors come together in a particular way to make movement possible or impossible for different social groups. Kesselring points out that our modern infrastructure of mobility, especially urban transit and platform-based ride services, are inherently unequal. While some groups, young professionals with smartphones and bank accounts, are deeply integrated into the actor network of ride-sharing or ride-hailing, others, such as elderly users, undocumented migrants, or low-income residents without digital literacy or smartphone access, are excluded by design inside these tech systems. In his analysis of post-automobile mobility cultures, he introduces the idea of mobility as a resource, not as a right. This resource is shaped by social class, employment precarity, family obligations, and state oversight. Actor network theory helps us visualize who is in the network and who is left out, not just in terms of technology, but in terms of structural visibility and even participation. To bring this back to Arizona, as I like to do here, think about the Valley Metro light rail system. On paper, it offers low-cost public transport or transit across parts of the Phoenix, Mesa, Tempe, and more. But from the actor network perspective, we'd ask, what actor is required for access to be meaningful? Is there housing near the rail? Are the train stations safe? Are they ADA compliant and accessible at all hours? Does the schedule align with the shift of work or the school commutes? In the Valley Metro app, is it usable by those without high-speed smartphones or strong English literacy? These questions show that mobility is only real when the actor network is fully assembled and black-boxed, and that missing links or affordable housing near transit, safe walking paths, multilingual info lead to systemic immobility. Kesselring also introduces the idea of mobility as path dependency. Where past infrastructures and policies limit current choices, for Phoenix, car-based infrastructure, suburban sprawl, and freeway dominance make non-car mobility structurally difficult. Digital mobility tools like Uber or Lyft replicate this bias by offering services primarily in profitable, dense areas, leaving working-class districts and outer neighborhoods underserved. As Kesselring notes, mobile risks biographies develop when people and their lack of access to movement becomes the central to their social vulnerabilities. For someone without a car in a car-centered city, the risk of missing work, healthcare, or education becomes materially embedded in networks itself. And then think about also the grid around them. I had an Uber driver once tell me recently when I was riding with them that this person was on their first day of work, and due to construction that's going on the highways right now, they were going to miss work. This Uber driver took a risk and actually drove off of the road down the hill to get to work, and she got there on time. But what if you didn't have this kind of like weird wanting to go off the road vehicle? And what if you were in a car that couldn't do that? And would that person have missed work? Who would have been responsible? Going back into our other conversations and some mini lectures we have. So for you students, there is a lesson in this. We must stop treating mobility as personal freedom and start seeing it as a networked possibility. Who moves, who waits, and who is stranded tells us a great deal about the material politics of access in modern life. So that Actor Network Lens offers us a map, not of where people go, but of what it takes to go anywhere at all. And this is what Kesselring's article kind of gives us. Well, let's move on to the next conversation inside this and look at Cerusi and Pearson, right? So Angela Cerusi's chapter, Digital Natural, Gender Norms in Black Mirror, unpacks how digital tools masquerade as objective lenses, but are actually drenched in normative assumptions, particularly around gender. I brought this article in because I thought it was so cool to look at Black Mirror this way. Platforms like Facebook or LinkedIn don't just allow self-expression, they dictate what expression can look like. And that Scott lens, reminds us that every feature on a platform, a drop down for gender, a character limitation in the bios, a pronoun field that defaults to binary, is a result of socio-technical negotiations. There were never neutral choices. They were never neutral choices. They were selected, stabilized, and made to feel natural. McLone's dictum that the medium is the message becomes painfully relevant here. As Carusi shows, when users engage platforms, they aren't just communicating, they're participating in the reproduction of dominant social norms or dominant linguistic theory um, through platform architecture. Drawing on Foucauldian lens as well as Judith Butler, Carusi argues that digital platforms naturalize gender expectations through replicated stylized acts. Gender, she reminds us, is not a noun but a verb. It is done repeatedly until it appears natural. But when users do gender in digital space, posting selfies, creating bios, managing their social scores per se, these performances are shaped and judged through platform logics. In the very well known, by some people who aren't even Black Mirror fans, nosedive in the Black Mirror episodes, the Black Mirror episode she analyzes most deeply in this article, we see Lacey pushed for failing to maintain the image of polished femininity that the social scoring system demands of her. This isn't a fictional overreach, it's a dramatized reality. TikTok and Instagram award similar kinds of performance, aesthetic, likable, emotionally positive, non-conforming. When Lacey loses her status, it's not because she changes as a person, it's because the system no longer deems her legible or profitable. Right? Carusi emphasizes that these representations reinforce dangerous feedback loops because gender acts are made hypervisible to platform architecture. They become digitally naturalized. This means that users begin to believe that certain expressions of gender are not only common but objectively correct. Just as Greta's consciousness in White Christmas is trapped performing unpaid domesticated labor, even to herself, real-life digital spaces confine users within stylized identity templates. So Judith Butler's performativity is no longer just social, it's platform mediated. Bringing this to current events, we can look at controversies around the Florida digital ID legislation, which restricted the way transgender folk and non-binary residents could be recognized. Here, interface design becomes legal infrastructure. If your gender didn't match the binary dropdown, you were denied access with this. This is the social construction of technology in real time, the stabilization of acceptable identities through design results in real-world exclusions. Carusi would argue that this is not accidental. It's a function of what the platforms do best, reduce complexity and control and commodify human behavior. In this classroom, as students, you should walk away understanding that access to platforms, whether social, political, or economic, is pre-structured. TikTok doesn't just show you what you like, it trains you to like what is already profitable or legible to the system. When users are told to be authentic, the authenticity is only available within a curated menu of said options. That social construction of technology helps us see that those options were once open to negotiation, but not anymore. McLoone helps us see that once they are encoded into the system, they become the unspoken message inside these platform and these platform controls. So students, when you're looking at this and you see people online, I want you to say, that's just how, when you hear people say, that's just how it is online, your job is to ask who made it that way and who benefits from it being the default. And I want you to use that C. Wright Millsian sociological imagination to ask these hard questions. So the next one here is by Klassen, who has an amazing TikTok, by the way, and Myers. So, labor platforms and structural asymmetries. The article Run Wild a Little with Your Imagination by Klassen and Casey Feisler, and Casey Feisler has an amazing TikTok, explores how speculative fiction, specifically through the lens of Black Mirror, can be used to teach ethical reflections in computing education. The Black Mirror Writers' Room classroom activity in this article invites students to project current technologies into future dystopias, or light mirror utopias, to critically examine potential harms, power imbalances, and ethical concerns embedded in our socio-technical systems. What makes this approach sociologically relevant is how it forces students, often STEM fields where ethical education is sparse, to consider not just the individual responsibility, but also the broader institutional and systemic injustices. Students' imagined futures often reflect contemporary social anxieties, such as surveillance capitalism, algorithmic hiring bias, or predictive policing. These exercises tap into the Robert Merton, or the famous sociologist Robert Merton's theory of anticipated consequences, and extend Michel Foucault's idea of biopower and discipline, helping students grasp how technological systems shape behavior, identity, and inequality. And in many ways, think about yourself. How about the article that you got to write in this class? Did you follow any of these biases? So, sociologically, this speculative work becomes a method of anticipatory critique, a way to surface not only technologies might become, but who they are likely to serve, marginalize, or exclude. Klassen and Feisler observed the students from marginalized identities, such as non binary disabled students, were significantly more likely to create futures that centered equity, access, and systemic justice. In contrast, students from more dominant social positions often deflated to narratives that reproduce familiar hierarchies or failed to address structural powers altogether. You might have heard this before, it sounds familiar. The distinction is not accidental. It reflects what standpoint theory teaches us. Our social position influences what we see, questions, and imagine. Perception is reality, Thomas theorem. Those who navigate systems of exclusion are often better equipped to notice it and their reproduction within technological designs. Without explicit intersectional scaffolding in the classroom, however, many students miss these dynamics entirely, treating technological harm as a glitch rather than a predictable outcome of biased design and institutional priorities. In this 334 class, this finds calls to us to reflect on our own assumptions, how lived experience or lack thereof shapes the kinds of technology futures we deem possible, just, or even worth imagining. Now consider how the IRS recently faced backlash for proposing facial recognition logins, a system that was shown to disproportionately misidentify Black and Brown users, raising serious concerns about racial bias baked into the so-called neutral technologies. Similarly, platforms like HireVue, which used AI-driven interviews to access candidates, have been criticized for their opaque algorithms and discriminatory outcomes against neurodivergent, disabled, and low-income applicants. These aren't speculative harms. They are real-world reflections of the very socio-technical inequalities Klassen and Feisler aim to surface through their ethical speculation exercise. For students in this class, the message is clear. Technologies do not emerge in a vacuum. They reflect assumptions, fears, and blind spots of those who build them, unless intentionally reimagined through an equity-focused lens. Additionally, to this urgency, Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, recently stated publicly that biometric behavioral security systems, including facial recognition and keynote stroking, are no longer secure in the advanced age. AI, according to Altman, the only remaining semi-reliant barrier is the traditional password, as systems have demonstrated the ability to bypass most identity-based authentication systems with increasing ease. This isn't just a technical critique, it's a sociological one. If security tools disproportionately misidentify or exclude certain groups and are easily undermined by the very technologies they aim to regulate, then certain groups are easily undermined and they become the one on this. Then we are left with a crisis of both justice and function. It reinforces the importance of ethical speculation, not as a science fiction, but as a critically interrogate what kinds of futures we are normalizing and who gets to be seen, who gets to be included in them. Think of your Black Mirror episode assignment of this course. Whose reality did your scenario represent? Who might have been left out? And even worse, why? So when we look at this in the age that we're within, we can also see this idea of misinformation networks. And this is where Grieve and colleagues provide a detailed socio-technical map of how conspiracy theories, particularly around COVID-19, gain traction on Twitter. They argued these aren't isolated or fringe beliefs, but emergent products of the network media environment, structured through both algorithmic and human actors, and the actor network theory is essential here. Conspiracy discourse is stabilized not only through users, but by bots, retweet functions, trending algorithms, and platform affordances like hashtags and character limits. The authors introduced the term microblogging micro-celebrities to describe how semi-autonomous users, often with fewer than 10,000 followers, became influential by posting sensationalized or misleading content. These actors exploit moments of uncertainty, such as lockdown mandates or shifting vaccine guidelines, to create an aura of distrust towards the scientific or governmental authority. What the actor network theory reveals is that these figures don't act in isolation. Their messages circulate because a vast socio-technical web of support and amplifies them, making conspiracy theories feel grassroots, organic, and truly even when they are factually incorrect. From the biopower perspective, these networks do more than misinformation. They shape how populations think, behave, and orient towards institutions. As Foucault might argue, power here operates not through coercion, but through the production of discursive regimes, ways of speaking and thinking that become normalized. Grieve and colleagues note how many tweets invoked themes of awakening, freedom, and resistance, positioning users as part of a righteous struggle against the corrupt elites. This isn't identity building. It's governance through effect, as users align themselves with the narratives to engage in these forms of self-surveillance and group policing, rewarding loyalty and punishing dissent. Think about how participants in anti-vax, Twitter, or QAnon discourse became markers of the political belonging. This aligns closely with the biopolitical power, shaping the conduct of individuals within groups, determining whose information is trusted and whose is marked as a threat to the social body. The infrastructure of Twitter and now X enables this by favoring content that is emotionally charged, easily spread, and algorithmically engaging. Importantly, Grieve and colleagues show that this access to information today is not a matter of being informed, but being networked into particular epistemological systems. This has major implications for SOCH 334 students like yourself trying to understand digital inequality. For instance, recent studies have shown misinformation spreads faster than correction on most platforms, and that older adults are more likely to believe and share false information, particularly how they lack media literacy, and partly because they're embedded in a different socio-technical networks than the younger users. Add this to the Elon Musk era changes to X, where the verified checkmarks can now be bought and moderation policies have become more opaque, and we have a platform whose architecturally increasing rewarding conspiracy logic over deliberative dialogue. So Grieve and colleagues are findings helping us see the structural shift, not the user problem. The takeaway that is in the information here has become a form of privilege, contingent on one person's position within the socio-technical hierarchies shaped by design, power, and even participation. And that actor network theory helps us trace how those networks' biopower helps us understand their effects. And as students, we should walk away recognizing that access to digital truth is not flat. It is stratified, engineered, and contested. And that leads us to our next article, which is looking at youth education and intentional reconfiguration, so biopower and reflexivity, as well as ANT. Anderson and colleagues offer a refreshing counterpoint to the often dystopianly discussed around technology and power and platforms. Their pilot study introduces a school-based curriculum aimed at promoting healthier, more reflective social media use among adolescents. Rather than framing social media inherently harmful, the program treats platforms as socio-technical environments, spaces that influence behavior through design features, feedback loops, and social clues. The curriculum emphasizes reflexivity, guiding students to notice how likes, streaks, and notifications manipulate attention and shape self-perception. This echoes the Foucauldian concept of biopower, how power is enacted through self-regulation rather than coercion. Students journaled about their social media habits, engaged in peer-led discussions, and participated in controlled media fasts, helping them connect the feeling of anxiety or compulsion or validation seeking to specific design logics embedded in the apps. These interventions underscore the digital habits are not purely personal. They are governed by algorithmic architectures, nudging us into cycles of comparison, consumption, or self-discipline. And crucially, the study found that the pedagogical investments led to greater awareness on time spent on platforms, perceived impact on mental health, and shifts online behavior. Students began to articulate how social media interfaces impacted their sleep, mood, and even relationships, with some explicitly referencing how features like streaks or For You feeds encourage compulsive checking. One notable takeaway was the role of self-tracking, not as a corporate imposed metric, but as a reflexive tool for noticing patterns of emotional and temporal displacement. The authors describe how adolescent users were able to identify that seemingly minor design features were shaping their routines and emotional states, offering a case of biopower becoming visible and contestable. This connects directly to our themes here in this class, where we study not only how technology shape behavior, but how users can gain sociological insights into these mechanisms. The curriculum's emphasis on journaling and group reflection echoes a participatory design and conscious raising practices from feminist and critical pedagogies, reinforcing that collective reflection can lead to collective resistance. And from an actor network perspective, right, this project forms a network of reassembly. The study encourages students and to see themselves as actors within these socio-technical systems, capable of altering dynamics by shifting routines, modifying notifications, or discussing algorithms with peer and parents. Rather than passive users, adolescence becomes agents of recalibration, and a system typically naturalizes its design. So you see these important factors that are moving within here. And then we see, as students in this class and learners, Anderson offers us a tangible example of how sociological theory can move from critique to intervention, aiming young users not just awareness, but with strategies for ethical and healthful participation. And that leads us to our next conversation when we look at another reading that you'll have. Oh, I'm so sorry. which is looking at Holt and his long conversation around subcultures of hacking. So this is another look at Holt and Pandit and colleagues. So youth environmental activism is no longer confined to protest marches or NGO petitions, right? It's unfolding through the socio-technical infrastructures of TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. In digitally natives, in Digitally Natives, a digital activist, Pandit and colleagues show how young people strategically use digital tools to reassemble activist networks. These networks include not just fellow youth, but also hashtag algorithms and viral aesthetics. From the actor network theory lens, these activists are not merely users, they are network engineers, creatively navigating opaque platforms of affordance to reshape how activism looks and feels. Their content isn't just informational, it's effective, symbiotic, and embodied. The curated green aesthetics, the emotional climate of confessionals, the collecting of rituals, sharing of memes, and duetting a protest call becomes a form of biopolitical resistance. For instance, when Representative AOC walked slightly with her hands behind her back during the 2022 abortion rights protests, mimicking the posture of being handcuffed, though she wasn't, it became a viral symbol of embodied dissent, one that circulated not because of its legal implications, but because of its visual power on social media. Likewise, youth climate activists sharing grief over despairingly coastlines of staging digital die-ins on Zoom weaponized effect of platform invisibility, turning their bodies, emotions, and digital footprints into tools of persuasion, solidarity, and disruption. And we also see the re-identification of action parallels them in Holt's 2007 article analyzing hacker subcultures. Holt identifies hackers as isolated cyber deviants, but as communities built through information sharing, skill exchange, and symbolic capital of insider language and boundary police. Their forms, tutorials, and cred-building rituals mirror the logic of youth in environmental campaigns, especially in how they resist mainstream legibility or legitimacy while still operating in the architectures of the internet. Holt's hackers construct themselves in opposition to the script kiddies and authorities, much like the youth climate activists distinguish between performative activism and real engagement. That social construction of technology helps us understand both cases as interpretive negotiations, where the tools of engagement, IRC channels, Instagrams, stories, or Discord servers reflect the values of norms of the community shaping them. So these communities also show how the action network theory in action, whether it's Python scripts or viral climate infographics, material and digital artifacts, co-produce identity, power, and credibility. Together, these articles ask students to rethink the binary resistance and control in both hacker spaces and climate organizing. Power doesn't just suppress, right? It also enables. As Foucault teaches us through biopower, systems like content moderation, visibility algorithms, and platform metrics don't just punish, they guide, incentivize, and control our behavior. When we see a TikTok challenge calling out Shell Oil or a subreddit sharing an an exploit to expose government surveillance, we are witnessing socio-technical systems in motion. These aren't merely the act of rebellion, they are the structured performances shaped by access, design, and control. And crucially, they reveal how deviance and dissent often shares the same code base. For students in this class, a simple takeaway, but profound, is whether you're reading a source code or scrolling a protest post, always ask, who built this network? Who controls it? And who benefits from its structure? And this is where we're also going to kind of get to wrapping up this course, but I want to do a quick summary that I want to make sure when you're reading your article on deepfakes and the considerations brought by Lundgaard, when we talk about access, many students picture internet speeds or whether it's a site is mobile friendly. But Lundgaard, Lee, and colleagues ask us to push beyond these surface interpretations. They argue that access visualization is not just simply about converting signed graphics into tactile representations for blind users, but we also have that they talk to us about how we understand how it's made, right? It's about the reimagining of the entire design process socio-technically. Through the lens of disability studies, the authors challenge the dominant medical model of disability, which sees impairment as a flaw to fix. Instead, they highlight the social model, which places responsibility on institutions, infrastructure, and designers to adapt to people, and not the other way around. Their case of the Perkins School for the Blind makes this plain. Assistive technology without participatory co-design risks, becoming a disability activist Liz Jackson calls a disability dongle, a flashy solution to a problem that a community didn't identify or wanted solved in that way. So if we use that actor network lens, we can understand this as a failure to include the rights actors in the network from the start. A truly inclusive design assembles humans, standards, and tactile technologies and feedback loops together. And this is where we kind of see that the paper that we see here critiques how well-meaning academics, even efforts, often privilege the high-tech solutions like 3D profiling or printing, while failing to meet community needs due to poor tactile resolutions of sustained support. The pay-fair chart redesign may look impressive, but if it requires a $330,000 printer for legible blind students, then the accessibility is performative, not practical. This reflects Weiner's conversation about how we look at the political systems that are involved in our technology. So what can be done? Lungard and colleagues propose a socio-technical approach grounded in participatory design, where people with disabilities are collaborators, not just test subjects. This echoes the broader trends in disability justice movements, such as the Nothing About Us Without Us campaign. Sociologically, it pushes us to see disability as not marginal, but as a powerful lens to evaluate design ethics, power, and equity. Just as we ask who is surveilled by Life 360 or optimized by Spotify algorithms, we must ask who is left out by data-driven learning environments, and why recent lawsuits against universities for failing caption lectures or providing alternative data access for blind students underscore how deep these issues run. In a class like this, students should see yourself that this is a broader platform policy issue, where inclusion requires not just compliance, but critical consciousness. When we say universal design, we must ask universal for whom? And how do we see that through the biopower lens? And this brings us to kind of the final thoughts of this class, as this is one of the last lectures that we have. As we cruise to the final curve of this class, it's worth slowing down to take in the view. This view isn't just about platforms or politics. It was about realizing that access is a terrain of power, shaped by layered histories and ongoing negotiations. Whether we're talking about teens reprogramming their relationship with Instagram, gig workers resisting algorithmic erasure, or blind learners excluded by flashy but impractical design, each case has taught us that socio-technical systems aren't just out there, they're everywhere, and we're inside them. The social lens or social construction of technology lens showed us how technology stabilized through social conflict and negotiation. The actor network theory lens reminded us that networks include people, policies, machines, and values, all work together to reproduce the world we inhabit. And biopower revealed that our identities, behaviors, and even desires are increasingly shaped by subtle architectures of control embedded in the apps, platforms, and devices. But more than anything, I hope that this course has brought you or taught you to resist the idea of technology just happens. It doesn't. It's built by people, by institutions, by politics, and by priorities. And because it's built, it can be reimagined. We're not too late. As you head out into this world of smart homes, glitchy AI, and biosurveillance, and attention economics, take your sociological lens with you. Use it to spot the invisible rules, challenges, and inherent defaults, and maybe even design something better. Ask who is included and who is left out. Ask what assumptions are buried inside the tools we use every day. And that's the heart of this technology and society class, not just learning about tech, but learning about how to intervene. So thanks for taking this ride with me, Professor McQueen. Now go out there and build networks that include designs that liberate and futures that reflect your values. And with that, good job. McQueen out.